somewhere along the Mississippi River, in a parish whose true name has been deliberately erased from every surviving record. There once stood a plantation where 17 men died in ways so disturbing that, in 1847, the authorities of Louisiana ordered all official documentation burned. What unsettles anyone who hears of it is not the number of dead, but the single detail that repeats across every surviving witness account. Each man was found with a small scrap of indigo-dyed cloth clenched in his hand, his eyes wide open, as though they had died in the middle of some terrible realization, and on his lips as far as anyone could hear. Before the last breath left his body, the same whispered name. Woman, they spoke of, appears in plantation ledgers as the most coveted piece of property in the entire Delta, yet no bill of sale for her can be found. For more than a century and a half, what happened on that unnamed plantation has been smothered under silence, smudged out of official histories and remembered only in diary fragments, coded letters between planters, and testimonies that were sealed away by court order until 1952. It is not a ghost story. It is something more frightening than that. It is the record of the deliberate, patient work of a woman who learned, in a world built to crush her, exactly how to turn men's desire into a weapon, and how to let their own obsessions pull the noose tight. The Mississippi Delta in 1839 was a place of glaring contradictions. White columned mansions rose straight out of the swamp, bright as bone against the dark curtain of cypress trees hung with Spanish moss. The air smelled of sugarcane and cotton, of mud and rot and money. Wealth lay thick on that land, the richest agricultural region in the United States, fortunes counted in hundreds of thousands of dollars. Everyone also knew exactly what that wealth rested on: the bent backs of enslaved people working from the first light until the fields vanished into darkness. The parish we will call St. Landry, though that was not its name, then was especially prosperous. It boasted 47 major plantations, each running like a private kingdom. The owner's word is absolute as any monarch's. Most were French Creole families who had held their land since before the Louisiana Purchase. They competed like petty kings. They measured themselves in crop yields, in the splendor of their houses, in the pedigrees of their horses, and, most disturbingly, in the quality and appearance of their human possessions. Among these grotesque hierarchies there existed a market that was never spoken of in daylight, and yet was woven into the fabric of every conversation after dark. Certain enslaved women, those considered exceptionally beautiful by the standards of the time, became the most coveted trophies among the planters. They were traded and gifted, passed from hand to hand and bed to bed, fought over in ways that plantation ledgers took great care not to record. The practice was so common that code words developed for it, phrases scattered through correspondence, that looked innocuous to outsiders and obvious to those in the circle. Into this world, in the spring of 1839, came a woman whose surviving descriptions sound less like the language of commerce and more like an attempt to capture something that made men uncomfortable even as they reached for it. She arrived in the parish in the custody of a cotton broker named Louisiana Thibault, a man known for locating rare and fine human beings for the wealthiest planters in Louisiana. In his journal, he referred to her only as the Gautier acquisition, a term that says as much about him as about her. He had bought her from a failing estate in Charleston for the astounding sum of $3,000, more than triple the price of a skilled male field hand. Thibault's journal, discovered in an attic in Baton Rouge in 1923, offers the earliest surviving description of her. He wrote that she possessed extraordinary classical features: skin like burnished copper, unusual height, a way of holding herself that made overseers lower their eyes. Her gaze, he noted, felt far too intelligent for his comfort. But there was one line in his entry that should have been a warning. She possesses a stillness that seems almost unnatural. He wrote, as if she is always watching, always calculating. I confess she unsettles me, though I cannot say precisely why. She was, by his reckoning, about 26 years old for a woman in that particular underworld trade, where the men who bought and sold preferred girls in their late teens or early 20s. Her age suggested a history, a depth of experience that men like Thibault did not care to think about. Whatever she had seen, they did not ask. They only saw what they wanted. Thibault planned to sell her at a private auction to the highest bidder among 5 of the wealthiest planters in the parish. The invitations had been sent. The price he expected to fetch would have paid off half his debts. But before the auction could take place, something occurred that none of the men involved would ever fully understand. The woman escaped, or seemed to escape. On the night before the sale, Thibault locked her in a rented room in a boarding house in Opelousas, the parish seat. The door was secured from the outside. The window was barred. A guard slept in a chair in the hallway. Yet when Thibault unlocked the door in the morning, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The barred window was still intact. The only sign she had been there was a single strip of indigo cloth torn from her dress and a faint, sweet fragrance that several witnesses described as oleander beautiful and poisonous. The entire parish erupted into a hunt. Patrols went crashing through swamps and along riverbanks, dogs baying, riders cursing. Notices were posted with generous rewards. Every free person of color was questioned. But 3 days later, the woman appeared of her own accord, walking calmly up the oak-lined drive of a plantation that belonged to a man named Sebastien Duval. Duval was one of the richest planters in Louisiana. He owned more than 200 enslaved people and 3,000 acres of sugarcane. He was 43, recently widowed, known for his cold intelligence and ruthless business sense. He was also one of the 5 men who had been invited to bid on her when household servants brought her to him, and Duval demanded to know why she had come to his plantation of all places. The woman answered with 3 words that shook the foundations of the world they lived in. "I chose you." In a system built on the idea that people like her had no choice in anything. Those words were almost blasphemous. Duval did not receive them as a threat or an accusation. He received them as a compliment. Flattered, excited by the sense of being singled out, he sent for Thibault, paid him double his asking price, $6,000 in cash, and took legal possession of her that very day. Within a week, the woman whom he now called Celeste in his records was installed not in the slave cabins, but in a small cottage on the property that had once housed his late wife's maid. She had fine clothing, her own servant, and, to the horror of polite society, she was seen walking in the gardens at Duval's side in the evenings, talking with him for hours. The parish rippled with scandal. White women whispered about her behind their fans at church. Planters muttered with a mixture of envy and disgust. Duval's relatives wrote stiff letters, urging him to remember his name, his station, his duty. He ignored them all, moving as though in a dream. No one then understood that Celeste had been watching Sebastien Duval long before she set foot on his land. She had learned the roots of his letters, the patterns of his debts, the list of his associates and rivals. She knew he was not as secure as he appeared. His sugar yields had declined for 2 years. His creditors were patient but not endless. She knew the names of the 5 other men in the parish whose fortunes intertwined with his, men who sat atop a structure built on human bodies, and she had a list. 3 months after, Celeste arrived on Duval's plantation. On a suffocating August evening when the air clung to skin like damp cloth, he hosted what would be remembered, and never on paper, as the last dinner party he ever gave. The guests were chosen with care. Armand Lair, Duval's neighbor and chief rival in sugar production. Octave Rousseau, a cotton planter whose family had held land in the parish since 1780. Théophile Boudreau, the youngest at 37, newly in control of his father's estate. And Philippe Saunier, the parish judge, whose influence touched every part of local law and commerce. Together with Duval, these men sat at the top of the pyramid. Between them, they owned more than 1,000 enslaved people and tens of thousands of acres. They controlled credit, prices, and fates. The evening began, as such evenings generally did. They drank cognac in the library, surrounded by dark polished wood and shelves of books few of them had read, while they spoke of markets and politics. At 8, they went into the dining room. Turtle soup, roasted duck, oysters 3 ways, wines from France older than some of the servants who poured them. Candle flames swayed in the heavy air. Underneath the polite talk, tension simmered. Each man knew of Celeste. None had yet seen her closely. Duval had been infuriatingly vague in his letters, hinting and withholding in equal measure. By dessert, they were restless and expectant, grown men waiting for a glimpse of property. Duval rang a small bell. The door opened. Celeste stepped into the room wearing a dress of deep indigo, a blue so dark it swallowed the candlelight around it. The cut of the dress was modest by any society standard, high-necked and long-sleeved, but it clung and moved in a way that made the room fall silent. She carried herself as if she stood in her own house, as if the men at the table were guests to be evaluated. Her eyes, gold brown, with a peculiar light in them, moved from face to face. Not shy, not pleading, but coolly appraising. Later, Judge Saunier would write to his brother in New Orleans, struggling for words. He had seen beautiful women in Paris and New York, women who had been trained from childhood to captivate. Yet he had never seen anyone who seemed so absolutely aware of her own power in a room where she legally had none, so disturbingly in command of her silence. Duval introduced her simply as Celeste. She said little. At his request, she recited a piece of French verse, her voice low and clear, the accent refined but not easily placed. She did not falter once. When she finished, she did something that would etch itself into the minds of every man at that table. She looked at each of them in turn, letting her gaze rest just a heartbeat longer than comfortable. When she reached the end of the line, she smiled. It was not a coy smile, nor was it welcoming. It was the small, knowing curve of someone who has already assessed the damage she can do. Then she turned and left, the faint sweetness of oleander lingering behind her. After midnight, the party broke up. Hands were shaken. Polite farewells were exchanged. Carriages rattled away into the humid dark. Within a week, the letters began. From Lair, from Rousseau, from Boudreau, from Saunier, each one, dressed up in formal language, was a plea. Offers to purchase Celeste arrived at the Duval plantation, each more extravagant than the last. $8,000, $10,000, $12,000, plus a prized mare. The sums were obscene, even by planter standards. And then there was Saunier's letter. which stripped away the politeness and exposed the raw obsession underneath. "Name your price," he wrote. "Whatever you wish, I shall pay. I must have her." Duval refused them all. His replies were cool and taunting. He wrote at length about her intelligence, her conversation, her understanding. He described strolling with her in the garden, her knowledge of music and poetry. He sounded less like a man speaking of property and more like a man defending a lover he barely understood. For 6 weeks the correspondence went on, increasingly desperate bids, increasingly cruel refusals. Friendships soured. Business deals turned brittle. Each man lay awake at night with the same image in his mind: indigo cloth, bright eyes, that unnerving smile. Then, on October 3rd, Sebastien Duval was found dead at his desk. A servant discovered him in the morning as dawn bled gray across the cane fields. Duval sat slumped over a half-written letter, ink still tacky on the page. His eyes stared at nothing, wide and glassy. In one hand he still gripped his pen. In the other, stiff fingers closed around a scrap of indigo cloth, torn from a dress. The local doctor came at once. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no obvious poison, no traces of vomit or blood. His heart, the doctor concluded, had simply stopped. A stroke, perhaps, or apoplexy. It was easier to write that on a certificate than to acknowledge what unsettled him. The expression frozen on Duval's face was not one of pain, but of horror, as if he had seen something just before the darkness closed. The unfinished letter on the desk was addressed to Lair. Its final broken lines were these: "You must not pursue this further. She is not what you think. I have made a terrible mistake in bringing her here. If you value your life and your soul, you will forget you ever saw." The ink trailed off where his hand had stopped moving. The servant spoke of a strange night. They heard Duval's voice raised in his study, as if he argued with someone. Yet whenever anyone came near, they heard only one voice. No one had gone in or out. No one had been admitted. As for Celestre was gone. Her cottage stood empty. The bed neatly made, her few possessions missing. On the pillow lay a folded scrap of indigo cloth and that same faint scent of oleander. Judge Philipsonier led the official inquiry. Slave patrols scoured the countryside. Notices promising rich rewards were nailed to posts. Yet for all the noise, something subtle happened beneath it. The investigation became less about finding the truth, and more about who would find Celeste first. Lair sent out his most trusted overseers, offering them rewards he could barely afford. He began selling off bits of land quietly to pay for the search. Rousseau chose another tactic. He hired a slave tracker from Mississippi named Caleb Frost, a man whose grim skill was knowing where the desperate might run. Boudreaux, edged toward madness by his longing, rode the back roads himself, interrogating every stranger, every boatman, every free black family he could corner, and saw who should have known better. Turned to the records. As judge, he had access to deeds, ledgers, letters, and court filings that no one else could see. He traced the sales of one woman through Charleston, Savannah, Virginia. Each time her name changed, each time the ink listed her as mere property. Yet in every place, he found a shadow in the margins. A planter in Charleston who had died suddenly of brain fever. 2 brothers in Savannah who killed each other in a duel for reasons no one could clearly explain. A Virginia estate ruined by a single catastrophic investment, its owner later discovered hanged in his tobacco barn. In each case, a woman of unusual beauty and unsettling intelligence had been sold away shortly before the disaster. The pattern could not be accident. Yet instead of recoiling, Saunier convinced himself that he, unlike the others, would not fall. He saw himself as a man, above their weaknesses, above their foolishness. His obsession was not love, he told himself, but curiosity, justice, control. Winter crept into the delta. The cane fields went stubble and gray. The weather swung between sudden cold and cloying warmth. Rumors took on lives of their own. In the slave quarters, people whispered that Celeste was the daughter of a Haitian priestess, schooled in dark rites to bend men's hearts. Others insisted she had been educated in France, trained in the arts of courtesans. Some said she had made a bargain with something not human at all. None of those explanations were true, and all of them were easier than the simplest one. She was a woman who had learned how much damage, patience, and knowledge could do in a world that insisted she had no power at all. In early December, she returned. A patrol found her walking along the river road as calmly as if she were heading to church. She did not run when they approached, did not plead or protest. She merely stood, hands folded, watching them with that same measured stillness that had once unnerved Thibault. The patrol leader, startled by the value of what he'd captured, chose not to deliver her to the nearest jail. Instead, he brought her directly to the man who led the investigation, Judge Philippe Saunier. Saunier had her placed in an empty overseer's cottage on his land, a small house, with a hearth and decent furniture. He set armed guards outside, but his instructions were careful. She was not to be harmed or insulted. That night, he went to her with candles, food, wine, and books. No one heard their words, but lights burned in the cottage until almost dawn. Those who passed close enough said they heard something more disturbing than argument or sobbing. They heard a woman's laughter, low and knowing. Threading through the cold air. The next morning, Saunier sent 3 identical letters to Lair, Rousseau, and Boudreau. The phrasing was clipped and cold. The matter of which they had all been concerned, he wrote, had been resolved. The property in question was now in his possession and would remain there. They were advised to forget the entire affair. Their answers revealed the fraying limits of reason. Lair's reply lurched between fury and pleading. Rousseau's letter carried veiled threats about legal action, as if the law existed to govern such things. Boudreau wrote 10 incoherent pages, confessing dreams in which a woman called him from dark water. Saunier ignored them. For 3 weeks he spent every evening in that cottage, sometimes staying until dawn. His wife, a woman from a prominent New Orleans family, packed her things, gathered their children, and left the parish without farewell. Saunier scarcely noticed. His appearance changed quickly. He grew gaunt. His clothes hung loose. A constant shadow ringed his eyes, not merely from lack of sleep, but from something hollowing him out from within. Colleagues began whispering about his judgments from the bench. He dismissed cases that should have gone forward, ruled unpredictably, forgetting precedents he had once quoted by heart. On the morning of December 27th, a servant found him lying in bed in that overseer's cottage, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as rigid and expressionless as a carved effigy. There were no wounds, no signs of poison in the obvious sense, but his hand, like Duval's, closed around a scrap of indigo cloth, and Celeste was gone again. The guards swore no one had entered or left the cottage. She had vanished as surely as smoke from an extinguished candle. Now there were 3 men left from that dinner party, and however any of them tried to speak of it, the parish felt hunted. At this point, reason could still have prevailed. The deaths of Duval and Saunier could have served as a warning. Lair might have accepted his fortune and withdrawn into defensive fear. Rousseau might have let his obsession go. Boudreau, haunted as he was, might have clung to survival. They did not. Obsession does not speak the language of self-preservation. With 2 of their rivals gone, each remaining man simply saw a clearer path to the prize. Judge Etienne Marching from Natchitoches was sent to replace Saunier and to oversee the investigation. He arrived in a parish that felt as if it were trying to hide from itself. Witnesses contradicted one another. Servants who knew far more than they said insisted they remembered nothing clearly. A second, more careful examination of Saunier's body found tiny traces of plant matter beneath his fingernails and between his teeth. Leaves he seemed to have chewed. A botanist in New Orleans identified them as oleander. Every part of that plant, he explained, was poisonous. Its toxins attacked the heart. Even a small amount, prepared properly, could be deadly. Still, there was no proof that oleander had been given to him deliberately. Marching listed the cause of death as heart failure with possible toxic involvement and closed the file. Officially. Unofficially, he kept asking questions. Meanwhile, Rousseau's tracker, Caleb Frost, claimed he finally had a lead. A free woman of color in New Orleans had seen a woman matching Celeste's description in a boarding house in the Treem neighborhood. Rousseau left his plantation at once, carrying $5,000 in cash and documents authorizing him to purchase property on site. He was gone 2 weeks. When he returned, he brought a woman back with him. She matched the known features: the height, the coppery skin, the unusual eyes. But those who had seen Celeste before said something was off. This woman's manner was subdued. Her stillness was different, not the poised watchfulness of a hunter, but the quiet of someone playing a part. If Rousseau noticed, he did not care. He installed her not in slave quarters but in the finest guest chamber of his house. He gave her jewelry and dresses. He quarreled with his housekeeper when she protested and dismissed the woman on the spot. Plantation business suffered. He spent almost every waking hour in that room. When Lair and Boudreau came, each in turn, demanding to see the woman and accusing him of hiding Celeste, Rousseau stood on his porch with a rifle and drove them away. "She chose me," he shouted after them. "She chose me, and I understand her in a way you never will. I will not die like the others." His words shook Lair and Boudreau more than any gun could have. For the first time, they began to entertain the possibility that what was happening was not random nor supernatural. They started looking not for a succubus or a demon, but for a pattern. Records told the story plainly to anyone willing to read. Celeste had been born on St. Domingue Hatch around 1813, or so the records claimed. She had been brought to the United States during the upheavals of the Haitian Revolution. She and her mother had belonged to a French planter named Gaspar Boudreau. A ship's manifest from 1804, when Gaspar fled the burning island for Louisiana, lists a Marguerite and child, age 5, among the enslaved. Then, after the voyage, their names vanish. Other records filled in pieces of the puzzle. For 2 years, Celeste had been owned by a Virginia botanist who filled his land with medicinal and poisonous plants. Enslaved workers tended foxglove, nightshade, castor beans, oleander. When the botanist died of an accidental poisoning in 1827, his widow sold off those servants first to Unsettled. She wrote, by how much they knew of death. Marchand stared at the documents. The dates did not align neatly with the age Thibault had given. But human beings were not ledgers. A child whose age had once been guessed in a hurry at a port could easily be misremembered or misrecorded later. What mattered was not the arithmetic but the line that ran through it. He traced Gaspar Boudreaux's path, from a plantation in bathed in blood and fire, to a ship fleeing across the Gulf, to new land carved out of a Louisiana swamp. On that ship, according to an elderly aunt of Théophile Boudreaux, something had happened that no official record admitted. The woman and child had tried to escape during the chaos on the island. She said Marguerite had been branded as punishment. The wound festered on the voyage. Gaspar decided she was a burden, and the child, marked as troublesome, would be no better. One night, he had them both dragged to the rail and thrown into the black water. When other passengers objected, he laughed and said the sharks would finish it. Later, he told everyone they had died of fever. If the child had survived, she would be in her 30s by 1839. Older than Thibault's estimate, but fear keeps faces from aging in the way the calendar expects. Rage preserves people. Whenever Marching tried to dismiss the idea as romantic nonsense, he remembered the letter found later on Théophile's desk, and doubt slid back into him like a knife. Lair, armed now with this history, rode to Rousseau's plantation one last time and demanded to see the woman in his house. When Rousseau refused and raised his rifle again, Lair shouted across the distance between them.
"She is not who you think she is. She has been killing men like you for more than 10 years. If you do not listen, you will die as Duval did, as Saunier did." Rousseau's answer was to fire over his head. Lair fled, not from the bullet, but from the look in the other man's eyes. That night, a romantic dinner was prepared by the woman Rousseau believed to be Celeste. The servants spoke later of roasted chicken, potatoes with herbs, a salad of mixed greens, bread from the oven. He drank wine with her. He laughed. He told her that now he understood, that he would treat her as an equal, as though his words could rewrite the past. In the morning he did not wake. His eyes were wide. His hand gripped indigo cloth. This time a physician from New Orleans examined him. In his stomach he found traces of cardiac glycosides, the poison of oleander. The salad, he concluded, had been mixed with young oleander leaves, close enough in flavor and appearance to other bitter greens that a man unfamiliar with plants would not notice. The woman had vanished. A young house servant named Marie told Marchand that she had seen the guest leaving just before dawn, traveling bag in her hand, moving toward the river road. But the woman had not looked quite the same. Her walk was different. Her face seemed altered. "Like she took off something," Marie said softly, "like a mask." The image followed Marchand back to his desk. A woman who could not only move through a world that refused to see her, but who could change herself at will when men did decide to look. A warrant was issued in Celeste's name, describing her carefully and warning that she was dangerous. $5,000 was offered for information leading to her capture. Posters went up in towns along the Mississippi. Slave patrols were ordered to bring in any woman who even vaguely matched the sketch. None of them found her. Marchand, recognizing a pattern that money and guns could not break, ordered protection for the two remaining men from that dinner, Lair and Boudreaux. Lair accepted gratefully. He moved into a hotel in Opelousas under guard, suspicious of every plate placed before him, every glass poured, every log added to his fire. Paranoia hollowed him out. He slept in twitching snatches, started at every sound, refused to let anyone stay near him for long. Boudreaux refused protection. By then, whatever strength his youth had once given him had been gnawed away by guilt and fear. His hair was streaked with premature gray. His hands shook constantly. He muttered to himself, answering voices only he could hear. When Marchand insisted, Boudreaux smiled a strange, tired smile and said, "You don't understand. She isn't coming to kill me. She's coming to free me. I have been waiting for her since I was a boy." He told Marchand to ask Celeste about the Boudreaux plantation in Saint-Domingue, about the fire in 1804, about the woman and child thrown into the sea. Then he closed his door and would say no more. When deputies came weeks later with orders to take him into custody for his own safety, they found the front door of the house open and a trail of small indigo scraps leading to his father's old study. Théophile sat at the desk, pen in hand, a letter neatly finished before him. His other hand was wrapped around a piece of indigo cloth. A cup of tea on the desk still steamed faintly. Floating in it were leaves the color of laurel, identified later as oleander. He had killed himself, but only after someone had sat with him and watched him do it. Servants said a woman had visited that afternoon, admitted at Boudreau's request, carrying a small basket. When she left, the basket remained. Inside were fresh oleander cuttings and a slim volume of French verse. The letter on the desk was addressed to Celeste. In it, Théophile confessed that he had stood as a child on the deck of a ship and watched a woman and a 5-year-old girl thrown into the sea. He had watched them struggle, heard them scream, and had said nothing. He had known from the moment he saw Celeste at Duval's dinner table that she was the child from the water. He had recognized her eyes. "I deserve this," he wrote. "I have carried your face in my memory for 34 years, and I deserve whatever ending you choose for me." 4 men were dead. Only Armand Lair remained, barricaded in his hotel room, surrounded by guards trying to build a fortress out of fear. For 43 days, Lair lived like that. The room stank of brandy and sweat and smoke. He trusted no one and nothing. He watched every meal from the moment the ingredients were taken from the pantry. He insisted on fresh water opened in front of him. He checked his own bed linens. He demanded guard changes every few hours, convinced that time itself might seduce them into betrayal. Judge Marchand visited him more than once. Each time he saw less of the proud planter and more of a man gnawed hollow by dread. Lair ranted about Celeste being something other than human, something the planters had brought with them from Haiti, something that had slipped the leash. Marchand tried to insist that she was flesh and blood, a woman who had learned how to use knowledge of plants and of men. Lair laughed bitterly, then wept into his hands. The search for Celeste widened. Her description was sent to neighboring states. River captains were questioned. Boarding houses were inspected. Marchand knew that even if she passed directly through a patrol, the men might not recognize her. They were looking for beauty and youth, for the indigo dress and haunting eyes described in letters. They were not looking at the women who cleaned their rooms and emptied their chamber pots. On March 28th, a letter arrived for Armand Lair at the hotel. The envelope was fine paper, sealed with wax tinted a dark blue. On the front, his name was written in a careful hand. Inside was a single sheet. The handwriting was firm, the sentences precise. She reminded him of the night on the ship when he had been 14 years old, standing beside Gaspard Boudreau and watching a woman and child thrown into the sea. She reminded him of the years afterward, of the families he had broken and the bodies he had worked to death, while telling himself he was a good master. She reminded him that men like him believed they could build prosperity on suffering and never face a reckoning. "I am not a demon," she wrote. "I am not a supernatural force. I am simply the consequence of your choices, delayed but not erased." She told him that by the time he read the words, she had already been in the hotel for 3 days. She described moving through the corridors in plain sight, unseen because she was not what anyone expected her to be. She explained, with a calm that chilled even Marchand when he later read it, that the guards were watching for an exquisite young enslaved woman, exotic and obvious, but would never suspect the chambermaid in her late 30s, with pockmarked skin and an ordinary name. He was told very clearly how his story would end. Marchand ordered the hotel searched from cellar to attic. Every guest was questioned, every employee interrogated. The chambermaids were brought before him. 2 older women who had worked there for years and 1 newer woman, a free woman of color named Louise Benoit. She was nearly 40, thick-waisted, her face scarred from childhood illness, her manner deferential. Her papers were in order. Her references were good. Marchand questioned her at length. She answered every query calmly. She admitted to tending Lair's fire each evening, as she did for other guests, with a guard watching her enter and leave. She seemed slightly amused by the attention, though she tried to hide it. It was her eyes that bothered him. Not their color. Many people had light-flecked eyes. But the way she met his gaze, as if the 2 of them shared an understanding that had not yet been spoken aloud. He ordered her arrested. She did not struggle. He had Lair's food examined. The brandy was clean, the water untainted. The wood in the fireplace was ordinary pine and oak. He found no trace of poison in the room. Lair, relieved that his supposed hunter had been caught, let himself relax for the first time in weeks. He ate a full meal. He drank 1 glass of brandy to steady his nerves. He slept. In the morning, the guards found him just as the others had been found. Eyes open, face contorted with a terror that no one in that hotel would ever forget. In his hand was a scrap of indigo cloth. Louise Benoit sat behind a locked door at the courthouse, waiting. "How did you do it?" Marchand asked her. "You were here all night. You never left this room." She smiled faintly. "Judge, you are asking the wrong question. The question is not who killed him, but when the poison entered his body." She spoke then of an entirely hypothetical method. Someone might, she suggested, tend a man's fire for weeks using logs cut from oleander branches, dried until they no longer look like anything but wood. Night after night, the smoke would carry small doses of toxin into his lungs. No single evening would be fatal, but the dose would build within him until the smallest additional strain, a heavy meal, a glass of brandy, a moment of calm after fear, would push his heart over the edge. "The firewood is gone," she said softly. "The smoke has vanished into the air. I am just a chambermaid. You have nothing you can put in a court record." Marchand charged her with murder anyway. At trial, he laid out the pattern of deaths, the letter she had supposedly written, the strange timing of Laire's collapse, the jury, a row of white men who could not comprehend that a black woman might spend decades weaving such a net, found those arguments unconvincing. There was no physical evidence, they argued, no eyewitness who had seen her administer poison. Suspicion alone, they decided, could not be allowed to condemn a free person. Louise Benoit was acquitted. She stepped out of the courthouse into the bright, noisy street and vanished into the city. People claimed to see her later that day in the market, or that evening by the river, or not at all. If she wished to disappear, the South offered endless shadows for a woman like her. Etienne Marchand did not forget her. He spent years afterward traveling quietly to Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, following the faint ink trail of a woman sold as property and moving through the cracks of a world that underestimated her. He pieced together what he could. He found at least 17 men whose deaths bore the same quiet marks: sudden collapse, unexplained heart failure, a history of cruelty and profit from the plantations of Saint-Domingue, scraps of indigo cloth, and, mentioned in letters, in diaries, in frightened whispers, the faint aroma of a poisonous flower. He gathered his findings into a private report. He never filed it with the court. Instead, he locked it away alongside another letter that arrived in 1865, postmarked Boston. In that letter, the writer addressed him by name. She thanked him, in her way, for forcing her to sharpen her methods. She told him she knew he had changed the way he saw the law, that he had become, in his later years, an advocate for reforms that recognize the humanity of the enslaved. "My work is finished," she wrote. "The men who murdered my mother are dead. The system that made them bold is crumbling. I was never a demon. I was a woman who refused to forget." She explained the indigo cloth at last. It came from the dress her mother had been wearing the night they were thrown overboard. She had kept a piece of it, she said, all those years, a small, stubborn proof that what happened had been real and that someone remembered leaving those blue scraps in dead men's hands was not a flourish, not a superstition. It was a statement. Her mother's death had not been swallowed whole by the sea. Marchand kept that letter hidden until his own end. He told his grandson about it, in a voice weakened by age, and confessed that he had hunted Celeste because it was his duty, but had gone to his grave quietly grateful that he had never succeeded. The law, he said, had called what she did murder. He did not dispute that. But where could she have gone for justice, in a world where the law declared her a piece of property, where her testimony would never outweigh a white man's word?
The story of the woman some called Celeste, and others only whispered of as the Indigo Terror, never found an official place in Louisiana's histories. In 1847, the state ordered what remained of the records sealed and eventually burned. The official reason was that the case might inspire insurrection. The unspoken reason was simpler. It proved that the masters were not untouchable, that the people they claimed to own could take from them the one thing they valued most, their certainty that nothing could reach them. But stories are hard to kill. In the slave quarters, people told their children tales of a woman who had survived being thrown into the sea, who had learned to read, to think, to study the plants the masters kept in their gardens. They spoke of how she had turned the secret market that traded in women's bodies into the very tool she used to dismantle the men who made it. They did not speak of her as a monster, but as a reminder. Sightings of her, or women said to be her, cropped up for decades. In Philadelphia in the 1850s, a woman with copper skin and intelligent eyes taught letters to free black children. In Canada, after the Fugitive Slave Act, a woman fitting her description guided escapees along the last stretch of the journey. In Paris, in the 1870s, someone recalled a quiet woman with a Haitian accent painting in a cold studio. Her walls hung with canvases of storms and dark seas. Whether any of those women were Celeste, no one can say. Perhaps, once her list was complete, she chose a quieter life, one in which she did not need to be anyone's fear. What is certain is that after 1840, no more men were found dead with indigo cloth in their hands and oleander on the air. The 5 planters who once sat so comfortably at Duval's table were gone within 7 months of that dinner. Their estates fractured and were sold. Their names, once spoken with such deference, slid out of everyday memory. No family carrying their blood remained in that parish long Inu.